Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pauline and I'm a policy manager at the Good Food Institute Europe. I hope that you don't feel like you've heard too much about alternative proteins and regulation, because I'm about to talk about both. But I will try to highlight the key challenges that the sector is facing and also highlighting some solutions. So trying to bring up real-life examples and best practices that I hope will be inspirational to most of you. Before I jump straight into the topic, I just wanted to take a few seconds to introduce you to the Good Food Institute, for those of you who don't know about us. So we are a non-profit, an international non-profit that works to advance alternative proteins, to build a more sustainable, secure, and just food systems. Our objective is to act as a catalyst in this field, and that's why we are working together with scientists, companies, and policymakers to enable the growth of this sector. We are 100% financed by philanthropy, so we're really trying to take an ecosystem approach and not favor one actor over the other. So what do we concretely mean with alternative proteins? Well, for us, this is what the current alternative protein landscape looks like, so all about providing the same meat and dairy experience to consumers, but at a fraction of their environmental costs. And we do that through using 3 different production platforms. First, with plants. Second, with various fermentation processes. Or finally, by directly cultivating meat from cells. In the EU, it's worth noting that you can already find some plant-based alternatives on your supermarket shelves, but when it comes to fermentation, like precision fermentation proteins or cultivated meat, none of them have been authorized in the EU yet. So, where are we now and what can we do to actually try and move forward? I will highlight what I think are the 3 most pressing challenges that alternative protein are facing. This sounds probably familiar to those of you that have been sitting here in this room since the beginning of the day. But yeah, nothing new to that. Scaling up, finding regulatory path to market, and also just fostering greater policy predictability are identified as the biggest challenges to the sector's growth, specifically in Europe. I will start with scaling up, infrastructure being one of the major bottlenecks to this effect, and specifically biomanufacturing infrastructure. The issue is simple. There's not enough biomanufacturing capacity to meet the expected market demand for alternative proteins. While we know that Europe already has great assets when it comes to fermentation facilities, there's actually limited availability when it comes to food-grade facilities. And I would even say sort of a mismatch with the existing capacity, because most of the food-grade facilities are actually at commercial scale. They are being utilized by more traditional fermentation sectors, such as beer or yogurt producers. But when it comes to the specificities of alternative proteins, and mostly precision fermentation and cultivated proteins, we're actually at a development stage where we would need more intermediary scales, so pilots or demo scales, for instance. A second reason that can partially explain this infrastructure gap is the costs and risks that are associated with building one's own facilities. I think we've heard that a lot already from both innovators and investors, but building one's facility is costly, and we know that investors tend to prefer low capital projects. So that makes it very difficult for alternative protein companies, especially bearing in mind that most of them still are startups or SMEs, to access finance to either build, expand, or even retrofit existing facilities. As a result, many companies end up in this so-called valley of death, where products either get stuck in the lab or get manufactured abroad. So how can policies actually bridge this valley of death? Well, first and foremost, we need more government support for alternative protein scale-up infrastructure. And I think here a key comparison I wanted to make is what has previously happened with the renewable energy and electric vehicle sector. We've seen how much public loan guarantees or development projects supported by government have actually helped this innovative sector growing in a very catalytic way. What has happened with this sector? We would like to see it happen with alternative proteins as well. A second impactful way to keep de-risking the scaling up process of alternative proteins is to keep fostering strategic public-private partnerships, and this across all levels of governance, so EU, national, regional, even local, if you'd like. A very great case study here is the Circular Bio-Based Europe Joint Undertaking, CBGU. I don't know if some of you are already familiar with that, but it has managed to bring together lots of various actors along the bio-based value chain. And we would like something similar happening for food biotech because it has its own set of complexities compared to other industrial biotech applications. Moving on to our second challenge, which I think was probably the most mentioned one and is definitely, looking at the short term, the biggest one that alternative protein companies will be facing. It's regulatory approval. Under EU law, most alternative protein products that have been produced using food biotechnologies must be approved either under the Novel Food Regulation or the GMO regulation. And both of these processes are known to be quite lengthy and complex, which results in high costs for alternative protein companies that want to penetrate the EU market. When we zoom out a bit and compare that to other jurisdictions, we can actually see that other regions are leading on that regulatory race. Looking at cultivated meat, it has already been authorized in the US, Singapore, and Israel. When it comes to precision fermentation dairy proteins, these have already been authorized in the US and Israel. And even when we look at Europe itself, the first applications for cultivated meat, for regulatory authorization of cultivated meat, haven't been submitted at EU level, but in the UK and Switzerland, so two non-EU countries. So this really shows the urgency for the EU to try and streamline its regulatory process. Otherwise, it just risks losing the global alternative protein race. Another critical element that doesn't really help alternative protein companies prioritize the EU as a regulatory market is the fact that this very same regulatory approval process is also quite political, and discussions can easily get polarized. So what do I mean by that? Is that the process is designed in a way that alternative proteins usually get two distinct approval processes. First, they are being assessed from a safety perspective by scientists. Second, once a product has been deemed safe, it has to be voted on by member state representatives, and that's where the process gets very political. What you can see here on the right side of the slide, a map that shows early signs of support or of opposition to cultivated meat. It's quite interesting to see that even though no regulatory file, like authorization file, has been submitted yet at the EU level, there's already this level of polarization happening. Leading the way in this oppositional movement is Italy, as it has already decided to unilaterally ban cultivated meat and even to ban research on the matter, which obviously poses lots of concerns in terms of single market protection. And once again, this sort of dynamics really shows the necessity for the EU to try and make sure that the approval process remains as science-based as possible. If a product is safe, then it should go to the market, and remain technology neutral, meaning we don't really care about how it's been produced. We should just look about what are the inherent properties of the product. A final challenge I wanted to touch upon with you today, and I think we've also addressed it a little bit earlier this morning, is the lack of a concrete policy vision at EU and national level. Europe still doesn't really know where it wants to be when it comes to biotech, but more specifically when it comes to food biotech. At EU level, we're also facing a sort of governance issue because biotech tends to seat across lots of different policy areas. So we can talk to innovation policymakers, to agri-food policymakers, to food safety policymakers. These are not the same people, and they often don't talk to each other, so that's really hard for innovators and investors to get the bigger picture and understand where the EU actually wants to head to in the next few years. So what I would like to see happen at EU, national, or even regional level is for governments to really try and start designing comprehensive policy action plans and roadmaps that not only acknowledge the role of food biotech in Europe, but also give us ways and mechanisms on how to get there. A first critical aspect, in my opinion, to that is to deliver a real industrial vision and even industrial ambitions that should be coupled with tailored public investment support. This has happened already in the clean tech space, so why not in alternative proteins? Another important aspect, in my opinion, is for policymakers to keep finding ways to better collaborate with industry and researchers to move the sector forward. Again, has been mentioned a lot during the previous session. One example I wanted to mention here is the recent Memorandum of Understanding that has been signed between the Innovation Agency of Lithuania and the cellular agriculture industry, where they both commit to support the growth of the cultivated meat sector. So quite encouraging to see that better dialogue between policymakers and industrial researchers can lead to such outcomes. Finally, another important critical issue, especially when it comes to food, is to deliver a comprehensive vision on how to integrate farmers into these new value chains. It's about creating new market opportunities for them and making sure that they can benefit from the growing sector. So, to conclude, and looking at the future of biotech in Europe, I think it's really important that innovations that have been born in Europe have the opportunity not only to grow in Europe, that's something we're starting hearing a lot in Brussels, but that they also get the opportunity to be sold in Europe that would eventually benefit the European economy and European consumers. A second trend, a second theme that I see for the future of food biotech is the need for greater policy clarity and predictability. When it comes to food biotech more specifically, I think that depolarizing the regulatory landscape will be essential if we want not only to foster more policy support, but also consumer support. As you mentioned earlier when introducing the session, it's also about consumer trust and safety. So I hope that this presentation, despite being a bit duplicative with what's already been mentioned today, has brought you some new perspective, and I'm open to any further exchanges you would like to have during a networking break or later on digitally. Thank you.
Thank you, Pauline, very much. There is one question that came in Slido, sure. And maybe you can provide a more general comment on that. At this moment, plant-based protein containing food is quite pricey.
Yeah.
And is there something in mind to reduce the cost so it is more price-friendly?
Yeah, no, definitely that's an issue. So at the Good Food Institute, our theory of change is that we will only get there when all of the alternative proteins I've mentioned earlier are as tasty and as affordable and also as accessible, meaning you can find them in the same places as their animal-based counterparts. So that is definitely a key priority for the sector. What can be done for that? Well, first, scaling, because you will achieve economies of scale, which will help us get closer to price parities. But then you also have lots of other enabling policies that can help. I think it was already mentioned earlier when it comes to VAT, for instance, that dairy benefits from VAT reductions compared to plant-based drinks in certain member states, for instance. There's just the overall level of subsidization when it comes to animal agriculture that obviously also reduces the price for consumers versus plant-based foods. and just giving more incentives to farmers to grow more crops, which will also help streamline a bit more plant-based food products, and consumer awareness, of course, educating consumers about the benefits of shifting towards a more plant-based diet.
Thank you for sharing your knowledge, your expertise, and answering to the question. Thank you so much.